Minister, thank you so much for joining us. The Dutch Minister of Defense, Ruben Brekelmans, thank you for joining us on the sidelines of the NATO summit, which will be just kicking off in a couple of days, or in 1 day time, I should say. I'd like to begin with just your reaction to what we saw over the weekend, the Trump administration striking deep within Iran. What has been your reaction to the last 36 hours? How does this sort of change the picture for you from where you sit?
Of course, we know the Iranian regime, with their development of their nuclear capabilities and also with their aggressive rhetoric, has been a threat to the region, to Israel in particular, and also to the rest of the world. So it's a fact that Israel and also the United States do not accept this threat anymore. So we have seen, of course, the attacks from the United States. I think it was also important that President Trump said this is the time to negotiate. And now Iran should come to the table to make sure that we get to a diplomatic solution. And we, as the Netherlands, and also with our European partners, we support this call. So I think we should now put pressure on Iran to sit at the table and to come to a sustainable solution.
And also watching this from Europe, what role do you think Europe has to play in the Middle East? Is it just as sort of negotiator? Is it a diplomatic role? Or is there something else for the Europeans to be involved with?
Yeah, of course, our role is mostly diplomatic. Also, we are, of course, an economic power because in the Middle East we have key trading partners. For some of the countries, we are the biggest trading partner. And of course, some European countries also have some military assets there. We, for example, as the Netherlands, have been in Iraq for a long time. But when it comes to the support to Israel, it's first and foremost, and predominantly, of course, the United States who is doing that. I don't foresee any particular role for the Netherlands there.
And in terms of the potential reprisals that we could see elsewhere, again, there's a very sort of a great many set of scenarios that we're all just sort of guessing about kind of what the consequence of this attack will be. Are you concerned that this could mean potentially a non-state actor, some kind of terror attack within the Netherlands? How do you think about that as Defense Minister?
Yeah, of course, one concern that I have is that it escalates in the region, also to other places. So take, for example, Iraq. We do know that there are Iranian militias there that have been a threat before. We also have a military inside Iraq, so of course that's a concern. But we also know that Iran, through some actors, have also been active here in the Netherlands. There have been accusations that they have been involved in some assassinations here in the Netherlands. So we are, of course, monitoring that. We are aware of that potential threat. And that's also one of the reasons why we call on Iran to say, do not further escalate this, do make sure that this does not further spread into further aggression, but let's now sit at the table and come to a peaceful solution.
And then in the broader context, and I'm thinking about the other connections that Iran and weakening Iran might have, do you think that this also weakens Russia?
I hope so, of course, because we have seen in the past that Iran has delivered drones and other technologies to Russia. I also know that Russia is currently able to produce Shahed drones, for example, themselves. So unfortunately, it's not a result now that there are no Shahed drones coming from Russia towards Ukraine anymore. But you do, of course, see that this axis, Russia, Iran, also China being involved, has become weaker. And that's positive, of course.
And then we have President Trump arriving here. We're convening all of these sort of heads of states of the NATO alliance meeting in The Hague over the next couple of days. What does success look like in your mind in these conversations, particularly when it comes to President Donald Trump?
First and foremost, if we agree to 5% spending on core defense and on defense-related matters, I think that would be an historic step. If you go 1 year back to the NATO summit in Washington, D.C., what we agreed upon is that the 2% is not a target, but it's a floor. So we are now 1 year later, and if we now move from 2% to 5%, with of course a 3.5% and a 1.5%, I think that would be an historic step, especially if 32 allies in unity agree on this. Second, it's important to me that we further scale up the defense industry. So tomorrow we will have a full day of discussions on the defense industry at the Defense Industry Forum. It would be great if we also strengthen our cooperation between the defense and militaries on the one hand and industry on the other hand. And also if we get to some concrete agreements and some concrete contracts. And third, I think it's also important that we reaffirm our commitment to Ukraine, reaffirm our support to Ukraine, because even this morning we saw a big attack from Russia on Kyiv and other places. And in order to make sure that Russia does not become a bigger threat to NATO, it's also important to maintain our steadfast support to Ukraine.
But just staying on the issue of Donald Trump, one of the things that's also hanging over the summit over the next few months is the United States sort of calculating its military posture, potentially removing troops from Europe. There's about 84,000 American military personnel here. Do you think that that is likely? Is that your base case that the United States will do that? And do you think actually what we saw over the weekend in Iran heightens the chance of that because the United States needs to focus some of its energies elsewhere?
What I heard so far at every meeting that I had with my American colleague or any plenary meetings with a larger group of countries, whether it's Secretary Rubio or Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, they all say that they are committed to NATO, that NATO is more relevant than ever, and that Article 5 remains a fundamental pillar to our transatlantic security. I think that's the foundation, and that remains solid. Of course, we need to keep discussing with the United States what military assets, how many troops they want to have in Europe. It could be that some of those resources will be shifted. I think that's quite likely that that's going to happen. But if we can do this in coordination, and if that happens gradually, and if the foundation still remains here in Europe, I think that's something that we can overcome.
And then one of the issues you invoked the 5% target for NATO. We've had some reporting overnight from Bloomberg that the Spanish have been intensely resistant to this figure and that they may now have got kind of an exception to basically contributing that much. Do you think there should be different rules for different players within the NATO alliance?
No, I think the rules are the same to everyone. I also think that Spain will sign the declaration on Wednesday when the NATO summit comes to an end. Of course, the reality is that countries have flexibility in the way that they implement these agreements. And that has been true in the past as well. In 2014, we agreed on the 2%. And many countries only this year reached the 2% or still have difficulty reaching it. So there is some flexibility in the rules that NATO sets, and it's both on the financial side but also on the military side. But I think in the end what it comes down to is that we all agree on the same percentage, that we do have military plans that were already agreed upon 2 weeks ago, and in which every country said, I'm willing to do my fair share. And I think that that's key, and that's as relevant for Spain as it is for any other country.
And you mentioned Ukraine, which has certainly taken a back burner, increasingly over the last 3 years as time has gone on, but really in the last week when we've seen what's been going on in Iran. We know that the United States basically has no longer any appetite to continue contributing to the support of Ukraine. Is the Netherlands willing to step up further if needed? Because we know that the Biden aid package will run out sometime this summer. What is the path forward for Ukraine, and what's the Netherlands' role in that?
Yeah, so we as the Netherlands, we have always been at the forefront when it comes to supporting Ukraine. That's why already a few weeks ago we said that for next year we will make available another $3.5 billion, which is around 0.3% of GDP. And out of that $3.5 billion, we will already spend $2 billion this year. So we are accelerating our support, we are scaling up our support. And if more is needed in the future to make sure that Ukraine is able to hold the line, we need to further discuss that also within the Netherlands. But with this $3.5 billion for next year that we will already spend to some degree this year, we have the financial room to further scale up and speed up our support. And
in terms of national defense build-out of defense within the Netherlands and within Europe more broadly, those are kind of two separate issues but connected. On the question of the Netherlands, how is what you're thinking about defense of the Netherlands changed over the last few years, seeing how the war has progressed in the Middle East and Ukraine, and how you're sort of looking to spend that money over the next few years now that there is all of this interest in spending that money across Europe?
Yeah, we do see that Russia, of course, is the biggest military threat towards Europe and also to the Netherlands. We also do see that as a result, NATO is requiring much more from us, especially when it comes to the land domain. We see that we have the biggest shortages there. So we had some additional investment packages which are focused on that. Also on air defense, we need to invest more, and we are currently doing that. And basically, any domain, because we see that we not only need to be able to fight, but we also need to be able to fight longer, because we see the war now is taking 3 years. So basically across any domain, also when it comes to logistics, to medical supplies, everything, we need to invest more. And what I do see is that there's a lot of support for the Netherlands, because people understand the threats that we are facing and understand that we need to step up. And that's why I'm happy that the current government and also a broad majority of Parliament said we support the 3.5 plus 1.5% because we do think that this is necessary for our security.
So the spending and the hardware are one side of it. There's also the personnel side of it, and this is an active debate in Germany, where I am based. Do you think that active sort of conscription and involuntary conscription for a certain period of time is going to be something that is going to be required in Europe and in the Netherlands?
I don't think so. We currently have a total personnel of 75,000. Yeah. We need to go to 100,000 in peacetime and then to be able to scale up to 200,000 when tensions go up. What we do see now, luckily, is that because people understand what is at stake, defense is more popular than ever. So we have different programs, for example, a service year, which is a voluntary year to work for defense. And it's oversubscribed massively. So our biggest challenge right now is to make sure that we can have people join, that we can train them, that we can educate them, and that we can provide them an attractive path within the military. And that's our biggest challenge right now. And I think given the popularity that we currently have and given the willingness of people to serve, I don't think it's necessary to get to mandatory forms of subscription.
And in the sort of broader context of what's going on in the world, and there's sort of a breaking up of the traditional multilateral order that usually the United States and Europe were very closely aligned, that is no longer really the case. We saw it at the G7, we see it repeatedly. Thinking about national security at the Dutch level, but national security at the European level, how do you make that sort of pitch? Because at the same time in the Netherlands, your government has just collapsed, in part because there's been a much larger sort of nationalist resurgence. Is there a tension that exists between those two things, and how do you bridge that, if there is, in the mind of the population and the voters?
So I agree with your analysis that the world is becoming less free, is becoming less globalized, is becoming less democratic, and I think that makes it even more important to make sure that we protect and preserve our freedom and our security and our way of life. We don't want to have a Europe in which Russia is setting the standard, in which Russian imperialism is becoming the new norm. And the only way that we are able to do that is if we, as a mid-sized country, or some would say even a small country, we are part of strong alliances. And NATO is and will remain the cornerstone of our security. If we are part of a stronger NATO, then we can keep Russian aggression far away from us. And then we can also face the hybrid threats that we are experiencing on a daily basis. So I would say to people in the Netherlands that might see something maybe attractive in rising nationalism or populism or whatever, if we want to protect our way of life, our freedom, our security, let's make sure we are part of a strong alliance in a world which is becoming more hostile and is becoming more dominated by powerful aggressors.